There it goes. This morning we continue in our study of spiritual success or distress. We are in the second grouping of this series of lessons. And as we talked about in the previous group, it gives us those examples of Jesus being the servant of God and that he served God and humanity with everything that he had. And that's a blessing. But it's also the illustration, example that we are to follow. Our lesson today, this is lesson number 2 in this section, is entitled, We Are Converted to Be Good Servants. And it's noted here in your handout, the people Jesus taught were quite familiar with servants. Their world had been more servants than free men. They clearly understood what a servant was. They also clearly understood the difference between good servants and bad servants. They likely knew good and bad servants. They understood what made good servants good and bad servants bad. And that was a truism. Servitude, or being a servant, was common throughout human history. Sometimes it was a good situation, and we read back over in the Old Testament where individuals, if they liked their master and their servant time, I'll get it out in a minute, their servant time come up to end, they would openly say, well, I want to continue to be your servant. And that's when we get the idea where they would go up to the doorpost and they would take an awl and pierce their ear. They were servants of this individual, this master, if you will. Servants was not something that they didn't understand. In our world today, there is still servitude. And it goes anywhere from the idea of an indenturement, which is, again, nothing new to the world, or it is a forced servitude. And I know we hear a lot on the news these days about people who are in forced servitude in our own backyards. And that's sad to know that people are forced into that situation. Then there are other aspects of being in service that are dictated that people choose servitude to be in service. Most of the time, I would suggest that we don't go up to a doorpost and drive an awl in our ear to denote our servitude. But our servitude is more monetary servitude than it is something else. But in these passages that's noted here, Matthew 24, 25, Luke 12, and 19, this is something people understood because it was common to their society. It says a good servant functions conscientiously and responsibly. He knew his master well. He understood what the master wanted. He knew exactly how to care for his master's interest. He understood his basic responsibility to help the master achieve his purposes. It did not matter if the master was or was not watching him. It did not matter if his master was out of the country or at home. A good servant conscientiously responsibly cared for the master's interest and purpose every day. He never forgot the master's desires and purposes. He never stopped watching his master's hand. His purpose in life was to help the master achieve his goals. And that is normally what a good servant would do. He understood what needed to be done, and he just went out and took care of business. Have you ever run across the individual that you could just turn loose and say, you know what you need to do? You've learned, you've been educated in what you need to do, and just they do it. Now that's a blessing. And that's what he's talking about here within these contexts of those who, what I call, they ride for the brand. They work for the master. And everything they do is to make sure that the master achieves his goals. And everything is like it needs to be. You don't have to be told every little thing or come back to the master and get further instruction. You just go do what needs done because you know what that is. Now, in contrast, a bad servant did not know his master. He cared little for understanding his master. He did what was necessary. There was a job to do today. There would be another one to do tomorrow. He feared the master. He did not call to the master's attention to himself. Do your job well enough to get unnoticed. It was safe. When the master watched, work hard. When the master did not watch, do only what is necessary. Live carefully and be a hard worker when the master is at home. Live carelessly and be lazy when the master is gone, surviving a life's goal. I probably always will be a servant. To survive, have fun when life and good fortune give the opportunity. And I'm sure that we have seen people that only put out enough effort to get by. They don't care whether the master is successful or not, as long as they are under the radar. And some of them aren't even under the radar, but as long as they do just enough to get by without some difficulty. That's a lot in today's society. You know, I made this example before, but whenever I was young, which was a long time ago, I we'd go out on a job, and I didn't, whether it was when I worked at the grocery store or if we were out in construction or whatever it was, we always tried to outdo the other guy. And I remember at the grocery store, there was me and another fella there, and we would get in a load of groceries off a truck. We would go back there, man. We was slinging them groceries off that truck, lickety split, getting them lined out. And then as soon as that truck pulled out, we had those things stacked on our carts, and we was in a race to see who could get the most groceries put on the shelf that day. Now, in our world today, sadly, it would be like, oh, well, we'll get it off here maybe after a while. Look at this big old pile we got back here. Well, let's go get a soda. Yeah, let's take a break. So we go take a break, and then we come back. Well, we might all take another break. People are not motivated like we were, I guess. If you was hauling hay, I was talking about that earlier. If there was two trucks in the field, what'd you do? You tried to outdo the other truck. Nowadays, it's to the point that, let's see, they've only got 1,000 bales done. I think we can get by with 99, 199, But that's the way it is. We out of Texas. this guy would bring a semi truck. I'm talking. Oh yeah. One man, driver, one man would come. He would unload that whole semi trailer, stack it. He didn't want no help. I can still remember asking once else, he'd rather do it himself because I guess he had hand in the past. And so it takes him a little bit longer. All by himself. By hand. We're not talking about having a sky track or a tractor or anything like that. We did all that by hand. Them was the good old days. They were not the good old days. I tell you what, I wouldn't mind stacking hay in a barn the way they do it today. Setting that air conditioned loader, and I could do that. Yeah, crawling up in the top of them old hot barns was tough. that was difficult, but we lived through it, didn't we? We lived through it. I tell you what. But back to servanthood, there are good servants and bad servants, and I I know of people today that are in positions of management, and they get people to come in, and honestly, uh, they can't keep help because they don't show up. I mean, they don't show up when they get there. They don't want to do anything, and they don't want to work. And I've noted with some of these people, and these are people I know personally, and I get, they talk about it. People come in and say, well, I don't want to work. I just want to check. I didn't know we could do that. Nobody told us when we were kids we could do that. It was hit the floor running and don't slow down till you got done. So, as a good servant, though, of God, that's what he's moving into here in Matthew 24. Let's drop over there right quick. Matthew 24. And we'll drop down to verse 45. Matthew 24:45. God has given us the instructions that we need from his word. We need to know those instructions. Now, if you work for a company or some kind of thing like that, they will give you a publication, a book, whatever, of what they expect, right? Most places do that kind of stuff. And they expect you to fulfill that. And if you don't, then you probably don't get to stay there very much longer. And I'm not going to get into the rest of that. God's given us his book. He's given us our instructions. He's told us what to do. He's given us the greatest blessing that mankind could ever have. And that is salvation through his son, Jesus Christ. So, as the servants, we need to fulfill our obligation to God like the good servant and not like the bad servant. In your outline, it has question 1 under Matthew 24. What servant would the master put in charge to feed his family? And going to verse 44 and 45, drop down to Matthew 24:44. It says, for this reason, you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. Who then is the faithful and sensible slave, whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Well, this servant or slave is one who is faithful and sensible. Now, could we say common sensible? Would that work? That's another thing that's lacking in our world. he notes here who would be the blessed servant or the blessed slave. Let's look at verse 46. Blessed is the slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. The word blessed denotes the idea of happy. Who's happy? Well, the slave. Happy is the slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. He's happy doing the master's bidding. He's happy doing his job. And the master, as we will note, will take care of him because of his faithfulness to what he needs to be doing. In number 3, it says, why would the master put this slave or servant in charge of everything he owned? Verse 47. It says, truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions, because he was doing what he needed to be doing. You know, recently I saw a deal where this individual was talking about an employee. And it seems that the employee and some of his family had become very loose with their financial situation, and they were in a bind. And this was one of those jobs that pays very well. Well, because they were in a financial strait, this employee's wife goes to the boss demanding that the boss, the owner of this company, pay the employee more money because they were in a financial strait of their own causing. And I'm not going to go into all the nitty-gritty on that. And that's kind of like having your mama go with you to an interview. I mean, people do that. It blows my mind. Or somebody will come along and say, well, you know, and I know a young man right now that is constantly, I asked him, I said, have you got out looking for a job? Well, you know, so-and-so said that this guy was going to hire and this guy's going to hire. Maybe I could go, maybe I could do. I said, son, go fill out the applications where you want to go to work. Somebody's not going to come along and offer you a job. You know, get out there and look for it. And I feel personally that I'm in a position to give that kind of advice to this young man. And anyway, but oh yeah, well, you know, this one said that we'll might be able to get the job here. You know, I said, no, get out there and look. I told him the other day whenever I saw him, I said, look, you're on your own now. I said, you're out on your own. You're 18. You've got all your certifications up, and you got to get out here and get busy. Yeah. Well, I think I got my certification about 11. I was certified in selling cards. I was 10 or 11, maybe. Could have been younger. But in the back of the, I don't know, we called them comic books. There was this deal where you could send in and you could sell cards. I sent that thing, sell cards, like Christmas cards and that kind of stuff. It was a little deal in the back of the comic book. I filled it out and sent it in. So they sent me all this stuff. And I couldn't have been over, I don't know, 8 to 10 years old, something like that. And the next thing I know, I'm going up and down the street selling cards. And I did pretty good. I learned to be a door-to-door salesman. And that was in Amarillo, Texas, you know. That was back in 1960, whatever it was. A little different than it is today. But hey, you know, if I hadn't sent in the card, I'd have never learned how to be a door-to-door salesman. And I know after that, by the time I got into junior high school, which would have been about the sixth, seventh grade, I had 2 full-time paper routes. And I didn't know anything different. I think I got my certification back then. It wasn't at 18, believe me. I did not. Anyway, continuing on here, I'm chasing rabbits this morning. It says, why would the master put his slave in charge of everything he owned? Because he was dependable. He did what he was supposed to do. Verse 48, what did the evil servant say in his heart? It says, but if that evil slave says in his heart, my master is not coming for a long time. I've seen people, honestly, if the boss wasn't around, they wasn't putting out any effort. And I think it's worse today than it was whenever I was younger, because we were always in a fizzle when I was younger, like I noted, to get ahead of somebody else. Today, though, I've seen people that if the boss is not right there, they don't do their work. And then what's sad, so many times in our world today, the boss will come in and see the work not done, and the one that didn't do their work has some excuse, and either by law or by whatever, they end up dumping that work on you. And that don't work. That doesn't float. We wonder why we have problems. But the evil slave not going to do their thing if the master's not there. Verse 49, how did the evil servant act? In verse 49, it says, and he begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards. He just went off the rail. I mean, he was out doing things he shouldn't be doing. And certainly not focusing on the master's outcome. In verses 50 and 51, it says, the master of the slaves will come on a day when he does not expect him, in an hour which he does not know. And I will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The question is, what would be the result and consequence of his behavior? Well, he'll have to deal with that consequence. Sadly, we live in an inconsequential world today. People don't think they have consequences for their actions. Sadly, many times they don't. But I want us to note in verse 50, the masters of the slave will come on a day when he does not expect. And I want us to reflect not on just the secular, but on the spiritual. Same thing is true with God. We don't know when Jesus is coming back. The thing is that we need to be ready. And we need to be in service. We need to be serving God in all aspects of our life. We know what he expects of us, and we need to manifest that in our daily lives. Let's quickly look down at chapter 25 of Matthew and verse 14. We pretty well know this parable. It's the parable of the talents. So I'm going to go through this kind of quickly this morning. It says, what did the master do? Why did he do it? In verse 14. He says, for it is just like a man about to go on a journey, who calls his own slaves and entrusts his possessions to them. And we know that it was dangerous to travel, and there was things that had to be continued at the home place. And that's why he would do that. He would bring them together and he would give them, this is what needs to be done. In number 2, it says, what determined the amount of money the master gave each servant? Verse 15. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his own ability, and he went on his journey. So he entrusted to each of these individuals a certain amount of talents, of money, due to their ability. That's a key thing, due to their ability. So he knew them. He knew these guys. In verse 16, it says, immediately the one who had received 5 talents went and traded with them and gained 5 more talents. In number 3 there, it says, what did the servant who received the huge financial amount of 5 talents immediately do? Put it to work. He was out there, doubled his money, that which the master had entrusted to him. In verse 17, in the same manner, the one who had received the 2 talents gained 2 more. Well, he saw what the first one did, and he did it also, or he knew what he needed to be doing with the talents that he had been given and had been entrusted to him. In verse 18, it says, but he who received the 1 talent went away and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. He didn't do what the master expected of him to do, was to at least come back with 2 talents. That's what the others did, but he buried it. When the master returned, this is number 6, when the master returned, he required a report, an accounting of how the servants had managed his money. Remember, ability determined what each man received. In A, under 6, it says, how did the master respond to the report of the servants who received the 5 and the 2 talents? Let's start there in verse 19 of Matthew 25. Now, after a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. The one who had received the 5 talents came up and brought 5 more talents, saying, Master, you entrusted 5 talents to me. See, I have gained 5 more talents. His master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. You know, he did well. He did what the master expected. And what did he get? He got a promotion. And he didn't have to bring his wife or his mama. He got a promotion. Well, let's look at the 2 talent men, verse 22. It says, also the one who had received the 2 talents came up and said, Master, you entrusted 2 talents to me. See, I have gained 2 more talents. His master said to him, well done, good and faithful slave. You are faithful in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. He got a boost. He got a better place. Maybe he even got a raise. Got more money or whatever it might have been. You know, that's the way God expects us. He expects us to know what he wants, and he expects us to be doing it and being fruitful, if I might use that word. In B under this, it says, how did the servant who received the 1 talent amount explain his motivation for his actions, or motive and motivation? Verse 24. It says, and the one also who had received the 1 talent came up and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. I was afraid, and I went away and hid your talents in the ground. See, you have what is yours. In other words, he didn't do anything. He didn't do anything at all. He was afraid. And, you know, we run into people who, I don't know, I guess we could use the word afraid, but they don't want to put out any effort for whatever reason. And if it's fear of getting out and doing it, You got to overcome those kind of things. Uh, you know, it's it's kind of unique and crazy to me that people don't want to put out the they don't want to buy into things. They don't want to own anything. They just kind of want to just go along. And if there comes a bump in the road, oh, the world has come to an end. So you understand how difficult life is. It's kind of like in verse 24, I knew you were a hard man, so I didn't want any problems. Number C, or letter C. What did the master call the servant who hid the money he received? Verse 26. But his master answered and said to him, you wicked, lazy slave, you knew that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I scattered no seed. Says, you know me. You know my situation. You know how I am. Verse 27. Then you ought to have put the money in the bank, and on my arrival I would have received my money back with interest. At least put it in the bank. Don't just bury it. Now, I want you to note quickly here that this servant didn't go out and drink up that 1 talent. He didn't send it on prostitutes. He didn't steal it for himself. He didn't send it to create a better standard of life for his family. He did not personally profit from the money in any way. The master did not sustain an actual loss. Why was this slave wicked and lazy? Well, in verse 30 it says, throw out the worthless slave into the outer darkness, in that place where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. He did not fulfill what the master desired for him to do. And we wonder about, what if I don't fulfill what God expects of me? And God has told us what we need to do. The same reality is true. We cannot hide the blessings that God has given us. But we need to utilize the blessings that we receive for His glory. So we'll begin there and look at some more of this next Lord's Day morning, if He wills.